February 26, 1945. German tanker Klaus Reinhardt had survived 2 years in his Invincible Tiger tank, watching American Shermans bounce shells off his armor like toys, until a single thunderous impact cracked his 100mm frontal plate and shattered everything he'd been told about German superiority. The Americans had secretly fielded a tank with a 105mm gun capable of punching through the Wehrmacht's most feared machine like paper, and German intelligence had no idea it existed. But how did the world's most advanced military completely miss a weapon that made their best tank obsolete? And what did this blindness reveal about why they were already destined to lose the war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. February 1945. The winter air hung cold and heavy over the Ruhr River Valley near Cologne, Germany. In the fading light, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt stood beside his Tiger tank, running his gloved hand along the thick steel armor. 100mm of hardened plate. Nothing the Americans had could pierce it. He knew this like he knew his own name. Klaus was 28 years old. For 2 years, he had commanded this 56-ton beast of war. His crew knew every sound the engine made, every quirk of the transmission, every sight picture through the gunner's scope. Franz Weber handled the massive 88mm gun. Otto Schmidt loaded the shells. Hans Müller drove. Dieter Koch operated the radio. Together, they had survived Normandy. They had fought through the hell of the Ardennes offensive. They were still alive because their tank was better than anything the enemy had. The war was going badly. Everyone knew it, though nobody said it out loud. American and British armies pushed deeper into Germany every day. Cities burned, refugees clogged the roads. But the panzer crews still believed. They had to believe. Their Tiger could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where the enemy could not even scratch their paint. Intelligence reports confirmed it again and again. American Shermans were death traps, weak armor, small guns. The German tankers called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up on the first hit. Klaus attended the morning briefing in a cold basement that smelled of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. The intelligence officer pointed at maps with a wooden stick. American armor was moving up. More Shermans, probably. Maybe some of the newer ones with the 76mm guns. Still not enough to worry a Tiger crew. The officer mentioned increased activity, but nothing unusual. Klaus and his men would take defensive positions and wait. That afternoon, Klaus took his Tiger on a reconnaissance patrol through the rubble of a destroyed village. The tracks clanked over broken bricks. Through his commander's periscope, he scanned the horizon. Movement caught his eye. American tanks rolling in formation about 2,000 meters out. He counted them, mostly Shermans as expected, but among them something different. Klaus adjusted his periscope, focusing hard. 3 tanks he had never seen before. They sat lower than Shermans, sleeker, more purposeful. And the gun barrels looked massive, as thick as his own 88mm, maybe thicker. He felt a twist in his stomach. Franz noticed them too. "What are those?" the gunner asked over the intercom. Klaus did not answer right away. Intelligence had said nothing about new American tanks, nothing about bigger guns. He watched the strange tanks move with an efficiency that seemed almost German, coordinated, deliberate, professional. "Probably another American experiment," Franz said, trying to sound confident. "You know how they are. Throw everything at the wall and see what works. It probably breaks down before it even reaches the battle." Klaus wanted to believe that, but something about those tanks made his throat tight. That gun barrel, it looked serious. It looked dangerous. For the first time in 2 years of armored combat, Klaus Reinhardt felt a small seed of doubt take root in his mind. What if the intelligence reports were wrong? What if the Americans had finally built something that could fight back? The encounter came 2 days later, near the small town of Elsdorf. Klaus positioned his Tiger in a hull-down defensive spot behind a pile of rubble that had once been a factory. Only the turret showed above the broken concrete and twisted metal. This was textbook tactics. The Tiger's strongest armor faced forward. The enemy would have to come to them across open ground. Every advantage belonged to Klaus and his crew. Through his periscope, Klaus watched the American column approach. The morning sun sat low behind the German lines, shining directly into the enemy's eyes. Perfect. He counted 8 Sherman tanks rolling forward in a loose formation. Behind them, spread wider, came 3 of those new tanks, the ones with the big guns. Someone back at headquarters had finally given them a name. Pershings, they were called. Klaus studied them through his optics. They moved differently than Shermans, lower to the ground. Be more careful. The crews seemed to know what they were doing. The range was close to 1,200 meters. Klaus let them come closer. At this distance, his 88 could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor like it was cardboard. The Americans could not hurt him yet. Their 75mm guns needed to get much closer, and even then, the shells would just bounce off. "Franz, target the lead Sherman," Klaus said into his throat microphone. His voice sounded calm. He had done this dozens of times before.
Franz traversed the turret with smooth precision. The massive gun swung left. "Ready," Franz said. "Fire." The Tiger rocked backward from the recoil. The 88mm shell crossed the distance in less than 2 seconds. The lead Sherman exploded in a shower of sparks and flame. The turret lifted off the hull and crashed down sideways. Black smoke poured out of every opening. Crew members scrambled out of the escape hatches, uniforms on fire, rolling in the dirt to put out the flames. "Target the second Sherman," Klaus ordered. His heart rate stayed steady. This was familiar. This was what Tigers did. Franz fired again. Another hit. Another burning Sherman. The American tank crews were brave. Klaus had to give them that. Instead of running, they kept coming forward, spreading out, trying to flank. Their guns flashed as they fired back. The shells hit the rubble around Klaus's Tiger. One round struck the frontal armor plate directly. The impact rang through the hull like a giant bell, but the armor held, not even a dent. The shell ricocheted away into the sky, tumbling end over end. Otto laughed nervously as he loaded another shell, like throwing rocks at a castle. Then everything changed. One of the Pershing tanks fired. The sound was different, deeper, more authoritative, like the bark of some huge animal. The shell hit the building next to Klaus's Tiger. The entire 3-story structure collapsed inward. Bricks and concrete and wooden beams crashed down in a thunderous avalanche of debris. Dust filled the air so thick Klaus could barely see through his periscope. "What was that?" Dieter shouted from the radio operator's position. Klaus's hands felt suddenly cold inside his gloves. That was not a 75mm gun, not even a 76. That shell had demolished a building with one shot. "Hans, back us up," Klaus ordered. "Now." The Tiger's engine roared, the tracks bit into the frozen ground, and the massive tank began reversing away from the rubble pile. Through the settling dust, Klaus saw the 3 Pershings advancing. They were not charging blindly like Shermans usually did. They moved from cover to cover, coordinating with each other, setting up overlapping fields of fire. This was not the American armor tactics Klaus had learned to expect. Another Pershing fired. This time the target was Klaus's Tiger. The shell covered 1,100 meters in an eye blink. It struck the Tiger's frontal armor plate dead center. The sound was like the end of the world. The entire tank shuddered. Klaus's head snapped forward and smashed into the periscope padding. Blood filled his mouth where he bit his tongue. Otto screamed. The loader's nose was gushing blood from the concussion. Klaus blinked away at the stars and looked at the armor plate. What he saw made his stomach drop. The 100mm steel had not bounced the shell. The plate was deformed inward. Spiderweb cracks spread across the surface. The weld seams had separated slightly. Another hit in the same spot would punch through. Klaus knew this with absolute certainty. Impossible, Franz breathed. The gunner's voice shook. Nothing can do that. Nothing. But something had done it. Klaus could see the evidence with his own eyes. The myth of tiger invincibility had just died. "Hans, full reverse, get us out of here," Klaus shouted. Panic crept into his voice. He had never retreated from American armor before. Never. The tiger was supposed to be superior. The tiger was supposed to dominate the battlefield. But that shell had cracked their armor like an eggshell.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The tiger backed away faster, engine screaming in reverse gear. To their left, Klaus saw another tiger from his company trying to reposition. The other tank commander had seen what happened. Everyone knew now. The Americans had brought something new to the fight, something dangerous. The Pershings pursued. They were slower than Shermans, but not by much, and they moved with tactical discipline that shocked Klaus. One Pershing would fire while the other two relocated, covering each other, working as a team. Where had the Americans learned to fight like this? The leftmost Pershing fired at the other German tiger. The range was down to 900 meters now. The shell hit the second tiger's turret ring, right where the turret met the hull, the weakest point. The German tank exploded. Not just caught fire, but exploded. The ammunition stored inside cooked off all at once. Flames shot 50 meters into the air. The turret lifted off like a toy and crashed down 20 meters away. Burning pieces of metal rained across the battlefield. Klaus had known that crew. He had drunk schnapps with the commander just last night. They had talked about going home when the war ended. Now they are gone, vaporized in an instant. The invincible tiger had become a funeral pyre. "Faster!" Klaus screamed at Hans. The driver pushed the engine to its limits. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. They reached a small ridge and dropped down behind it, finally breaking line of sight with the Pershings. Klaus's hands trembled on the turret controls. His heart hammered in his chest. Sweat ran down his face despite the cold. They made it back to the battalion headquarters, a farmhouse 3 kilometers behind the lines. Klaus climbed out of the tiger on shaking legs. He looked back at his tank. The deformed armor plate stared at him like an accusation. This machine that had kept him alive for 2 years. This steel fortress that had seemed invincible. It had failed. Or rather, the Americans had finally built something strong enough to beat it. Klaus stormed into the headquarters building. The intelligence officer sat at a desk covered with papers and maps. He was a thin man with glasses who had never been in a tank, never felt an enemy shell hit his armor. Klaus slammed his fist down on the desk hard enough to make the officer jump. "What gun do those Pershing tanks have?" Klaus demanded. His voice was too loud, but he did not care. The intelligence officer shuffled through papers nervously. "We are still gathering information, Herr Oberleutnant. Initial reports suggest a 90mm gun, possibly." "That was not a 90mm, Klaus shouted. He had faced 90mm anti-aircraft guns in Normandy. He knew what they could do. This was different. This was heavier, much heavier. I watched it crack my frontal armor. I watched it blow up a tiger with one shot. What gun does that?" The officer's face went pale. He pulled out another report from a folder. His hands shook slightly as he read it. "There are some unconfirmed reports. Some intelligence suggests certain Pershing variants may mount a larger gun, possibly a 105mm weapon." The room went silent. Klaus stared at the officer. 105mm. That was bigger than the Tiger's famous 88. It was an anti-aircraft gun size. That was artillery size. The Americans had put an artillery piece on a tank. Why were we not told about this? Klaus asked quietly. His anger had burned out, replaced by cold fear. The officer said he would not meet Klaus's eyes. "We thought it was an error, American propaganda perhaps. We did not believe they could actually build such a weapon and make it work on a tank chassis." Klaus turned and walked out without another word. Behind the farmhouse, he found Franz smoking a cigarette with trembling hands. Otto sat nearby, holding a cloth to his still bleeding nose. The rest of the crew looked like ghosts. They had all seen the same thing. They all knew what it meant. That night, a captured American technical manual made it to the headquarters. Someone in intelligence had finally done their job. Klaus read the specifications by candlelight. The T-26E4 Super Pershing mounted a 90mm high-velocity gun as standard. But field modifications existed. Some tanks had been fitted with the experimental 105mm T5E1 gun. The same gun is used on anti-aircraft artillery. The muzzle velocity was 3,000 feet per second. The penetration at 1,000 meters was 200 millimeters of hardened steel. Klaus read that number 3 times. 200 millimeters. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick. The Pershing's gun could punch through double that thickness. The math was simple and brutal. At any combat range, the Pershing could kill a Tiger. The Tiger could hurt the Pershing, yes, but it was no longer the guaranteed winner. Klaus sat in his Tiger's turret that night, unable to sleep. The deformed armor plate was still warm to the touch from the hit they had taken. He ran his fingers over the cracks. For 2 years, this armor had been his shield, his protection, his confidence. Now it was just metal. Thick metal, but not thick enough. Everything Klaus had been told about the Americans was falling apart in his mind. The propaganda films showed American soldiers as weak, undisciplined. Their industry produced cheap junk in huge quantities. Their tanks were inferior copies of British designs. Their workers were lazy. Their society was soft and decadent. None of it was true. The Americans had designed this Pershing tank from scratch. They had figured out how to mount a massive gun on a mobile chassis and make it reliable. They had trained crews to use it with tactical skill. And they had done all of this while still producing thousands of Shermans. Germany scraped together every piece of steel, every drop of fuel, every trained worker, just to build a few Tigers. America built the Pershing as an experiment, as an afterthought, while simultaneously outproducing Germany 10-to-1 in standard tanks. Klaus thought about the briefings he had attended, the confident assertions about German technical superiority, the dismissive jokes about American engineering, the absolute certainty that German tanks were the best in the world. All of it had been lies. Or worse, it had been true once, but was no longer true, and nobody wanted to admit it. Franz climbed up onto the tank and sat next to Klaus in the cold darkness. For a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, Franz asked the question that Klaus had been thinking about all evening. "Herr Oberleutnant, if the Americans can build a tank like that, if they can put a 105mm gun on a chassis and make it work, what else do they have that we do not know about?"
Klaus had no answer, but the question terrified him. Because if American intelligence had been this wrong about one tank, what else were they wrong about? What other weapons existed that German command did not believe were possible? A week later, Klaus's unit overran a small American supply depot during a counterattack. Among the captured equipment, Klaus found things that disturbed him more than the Pershing's gun. American radio sets that were half the size of German models and worked better. Medical supplies in huge quantities, including drugs Germany could barely produce anymore. Ration boxes that included chocolate, cigarettes, and candy. A notebook from an American tank sergeant that mentioned something called the GI Bill, a government program that would pay for soldiers to go to college after the war ended. Klaus read that notebook entry 3 times. America was fighting a total war. Millions of men in uniform, massive industrial production, naval battles across 2 oceans, strategic bombing campaigns. And somehow, simultaneously, they were planning to educate their veterans when peace came. Germany could barely feed its civilians. Every resource went to the war machine. There was no plan for after the war because everyone knew Germany was losing. But America fought with one eye already on peacetime. They had resources to spare. That night, another intelligence report crossed Klaus's desk. He almost threw it away, but something made him read it. American tank production in 1944 had exceeded 17,000 vehicles. German tank production in the same year was under 6,000. Klaus stared at those numbers until his eyes hurt. 17,000 versus 6,000. Almost 3 to 1. And the Americans were building better tanks now, not just more tanks. Klaus did some math in his head. Even if German tanks were superior, which he no longer believed, the numbers made victory impossible. If it took 3 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, America could afford that trade. They had the tanks to spare. Germany did not. Every Tiger lost was irreplaceable. Every trained crew killed was a hole that could not be filled. Meanwhile, America stamped out tanks like a factory making cars and trained new crews faster than Germany could kill them. This was not a war anymore. It was arithmetic. And Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. Klaus opened his diary that night and wrote by candlelight. His hand shook as he formed the words. We were told the Tiger made us invincible. We believed it because we had to believe something. But today, I watched our invincibility burn. The Americans did not just match our tank, they exceeded it. And they did it casually, as if designing a tank destroyer was just another job for their engineers. What frightens me is not that they built a better tank. It is how easily they did it. While we struggle to find parts and fuel, they experiment with new weapons. While we substitute materials and cut corners, they innovate and improve. We were told America was weak. We were told their industry was inferior. We were told their mongrel society could never match German discipline and engineering. But discipline does not forge steel. Factories do. And they have more factories than we ever imagined. More steel, more oil, more everything. We are not fighting American soldiers anymore. We are fighting an entire continent's industrial power. And that is a battle that courage cannot win. Klaus closed the diary and looked up at the stars through the open turret hatch. Somewhere out there in the darkness, more Pershings were rolling toward the front lines. More American tanks were being loaded onto ships. More factories were running 3 shifts around the clock, stamping out the weapons that would end this war. And there was nothing Klaus or his crew or his Tiger tank could do to stop it. The war was already over. The Americans had won it in their factories before the first shot was ever fired. Germany just hadn't realized it yet. The moment everything truly shattered came 3 weeks later on a cold March morning. Klaus and his crew had been pulled back from the front lines for maintenance. The Tiger needed track repairs and a new transmission part that probably didn't exist anymore. They sat in a farm field turned into a makeshift motor pool, watching mechanics work on tanks that would likely never run again. An order came down from division headquarters. All tank commanders were to attend a special briefing. Klaus walked into the meeting room expecting another pointless lecture. Instead, he found something different. On the table sat pieces of a destroyed Pershing tank. The Americans had abandoned one after it threw a track, and German engineers had finally gotten their hands on it. Klaus stepped closer and looked at the armor samples. The steel was thick, but not as thick as Tiger armor. The engineering was different, simpler in some ways. The welds were clean and uniform, done by machines instead of skilled craftsmen.
Everything about the tank screamed mass production. It was built to be made quickly and in large numbers. Yet it still mounted that massive gun. It still worked. An engineer from the testing grounds stood up to speak. He was an older man who had designed tank parts before the war. He pointed at the Pershing components with a wooden pointer. "This tank represents a different philosophy," he said quietly. "We build tanks to be the absolute best. Perfect engineering, maximum capability. The Americans build tanks to be good enough. But they build many of them. And now, good enough has become better than our best." The room stayed silent. No one wanted to admit what everyone knew. The engineer continued. "This gun system is borrowed from anti-aircraft artillery. They took an existing weapon and adapted it. We would never do that. We would design something new from scratch, something perfect. But their way worked, and it worked faster."
Klaus stared at the gun breech mechanism. It was elegant in its simplicity. Any mechanic could fix it. Any factory could build it. The Tiger's systems were masterpieces of engineering, but they required specialists to maintain and factories with skilled workers to produce. The Pershing could be repaired in a field workshop and built in a factory staffed by people who had never made tanks before. That afternoon, Klaus walked through the motor pool and really looked at the German tanks for the first time with clear eyes. Tigers and Panthers and Mark IVs, all broken down, waiting for parts that would never come, waiting for fuel that did not exist, waiting for trained crews to replace the dead ones. Magnificent machines built by a nation that no longer had the resources to support them. He thought about all the Pershings rolling off American assembly lines right now. All the crews are being trained. All the fuel and ammunition being loaded onto ships. An endless tide of steel and firepower that Germany could not match. That night, France found Klaus sitting alone in the Tiger's turret again. The gunner climbed up without asking permission and sat down. For a long time, they watched the sunset over the destroyed German countryside. Finally, France spoke. "Do you think we were lied to, Herr Oberleutnant, about America?" Klaus thought carefully before answering. "I think we were told what the leadership wanted to be true, and we believed it because we needed to believe something. The Tiger made us feel powerful, superior. But power and superiority are not the same thing. A man with a sword is not superior to a man with a rifle, no matter how well the sword is made." Franz nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about that American notebook we found, the one that talked about college after the war. They are fighting just as hard as we are, but they are already planning for peace. What does that say about them?" "It says they know they are going to win," Klaus answered. "It says they have so many resources that they can fight a war and plan for the future at the same time. We put everything into the war machine, every piece of steel, every drop of fuel, every man. And it still was not enough." Klaus pulled out his diary and wrote while Franz watched. The words came easier now. The truth hurt less when he put it on paper. "The propaganda told us that America was soft, that their mixed society made them weak, that they could not match German discipline and will. But we confused hardness with strength. We thought suffering made us superior. We were wrong. America did not need to be hard. They had resources. They had factories that dwarfed ours. They had oil fields and steel mills and workers by the millions. They had universities training engineers while we had schools training soldiers. They built weapons as experiments, while we built them as last hopes. The Pershing exists because American industry could afford to try new things, because they had the steel to waste on prototypes, because they had enough standard tanks already that they could build specialized ones for specific missions. We could never do that. Every Tiger we built was precious, irreplaceable. A single loss was a disaster. I understand now why we lost. Not because our soldiers were not brave enough. Not because our tanks were not good enough.
We lost because war is not about bravery or quality anymore. Modern war is industrial. It is about how many factories you have, how much oil you can pump, how many workers you can train, how fast you can replace losses and adapt to new problems. The Tiger was our masterpiece, but masterpieces do not win wars. Production does. Innovation does. The ability to build something good enough, fast enough, does. America understood this. We did not. I think about all the speeches I heard, all the promises about wonder weapons that would turn the tide. The jet fighters, the super heavy tanks, the rockets. All of them too late, too few, too complicated. While we chased perfection, America built adequacy by the thousands. And adequacy in huge numbers beats perfection in small numbers every single time. The 105mm gun on the Pershing is not just a weapon. It is a message. It says that America can build anything they want, as much as they want, whenever they want. And we cannot stop them. We never could. We were fighting their industrial capacity, and that battle was over before it began. I feel like I woke up from a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Everything I believed about German superiority was a lie. Not because German engineering is bad. It is excellent. But excellence without resources is just craftsmanship. And craftsmanship does not win modern wars. What makes me angry is not that we lost. It is that we could have known. The information was there. America's industrial output, their population, their resources. But we chose not to see it. We chose to believe in our own mythology. And men died because of that choice. Good men, my friends, all gone because we believed a comfortable lie instead of an uncomfortable truth. Klaus closed the diary and looked at Franz. The gunner's face was thoughtful in the fading light. "What will you do after the war?" Klaus asked.
If I survive, go home, build something, maybe study engineering, learn from what the Americans did right. Franz paused. What about you? The same, Klaus said. Learn, remember, make sure the next generation does not make the same mistakes we did. Make sure they understand that national pride without national capability is just empty words. The sun finished setting. Darkness covered the broken tanks and the broken countryside and the broken army. But Klaus felt oddly at peace. The illusion was gone. The truth was painful but clear, and clarity, even painful clarity, was better than comfortable lies. The Tiger ran out of fuel outside Dusseldorf in the first week of April 1945. Klaus and his crew sat in the disabled tank for 2 hours, listening to American artillery getting closer. The ammunition was gone. The fuel tanks were empty. The radio was dead. There was nothing left to fight with and nowhere left to run. When the American soldiers arrived, Klaus ordered his crew to climb out with their hands up. 5 men who had lived together in a steel box for 2 years, now surrendering on a muddy road. The Americans were professional, almost polite. They searched the Germans for weapons, gave them water, and pointed them toward a collection area. One American officer, a tank commander himself based on his uniform, stopped to look at the Tiger. He walked around it slowly, studying the gun, the armor, the tracks. Then he looked at Klaus. "You were at Elsdorf," the American said. It was not a question. "We heard about that fight. Your crew did well. But you know what? Wars are not won by having the best tank. They are won by having the best logistics." He patted the Tiger's armor once, almost respectfully, and walked away. Klaus watched him go. The American was right. The Tiger was still a magnificent machine, but a magnificent machine without fuel or ammunition or spare parts was just 56 tons of useless metal. The prisoner of war camp was in France, near Reims. Thousands of German soldiers crowded into a field surrounded by wire fences. But the camp was organized, orderly. The Americans provided adequate food, medical care, and shelter. Klaus had expected much worse. He had been told Americans were barbaric to prisoners. Another lie. What shocked Klaus was the scale of everything around the camp. American supply convoys rolled past on the nearby road day and night. Endless trucks carrying food, fuel, ammunition, equipment. The convoys never stopped. Klaus tried counting them once and gave up after 200 vehicles. That was just one day on one road. How many roads were there? How many convoys? The numbers were impossible to imagine. A German general in the camp, a man who had commanded a panzer division, spoke quietly to a group of officers one evening. "I visited America in 1938, he said. "I saw their automotive factories. I told my superiors we could never win a war against such industrial capacity. They did not listen." The general laughed bitterly. "They said Americans were soft, undisciplined, that our will would overcome their numbers. But will not build tanks. Factories do." The Americans gave the prisoners newspapers and magazines. Klaus read about the war in the Pacific, about the massive fleet America had built, about the invasions and the island battles. America was fighting a full war on the other side of the world while simultaneously crushing Germany, fighting two wars at once and winning both. How could any nation have such resources? Klaus was released in early 1946. The train ride back to Germany was silent. Hundreds of former soldiers, all thinking the same thoughts, all wondering what they would find at home. Klaus stared out the window at France rolling past. The war damage was everywhere, but already he could see reconstruction beginning. New buildings rising from the rubble. People working. Life continues. Germany was worse, much worse. Cologne was a city of broken stones. Klaus walked through streets he barely recognized. Most of the buildings were gone. The cathedral stood damaged but still standing, surrounded by complete destruction. People lived in cellars and makeshift shelters. Food was scarce. Everything was scarce. Klaus found his family in the basement of what had been their apartment building. His mother and father and sister had survived, though they looked thin and tired. His father had worked as an engineer at a tank factory. The factory was rubble now. His father's hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. "We built the best tanks in the world," his father said. His voice was empty. "The Tiger, the Panther, the best engineering anywhere." Klaus sat down beside his father in the cold basement. "We built very good tanks," he said gently, "but the Americans built enough tanks, and enough beats best when the numbers are that different." His father looked at him for a long moment. "You understand now." "Yes," Klaus said, "I understand." In the months that followed, Klaus found work helping rebuild the city. The pay was almost nothing, but it was something to do, something to build instead of destroy. He watched American engineers arrive with equipment and plans. They worked with an efficiency that reminded Klaus of how Pershing tanks had moved on the battlefield. Organized, systematic, effective. Klaus started studying American industrial methods, assembly lines, standardization, mass production techniques. Other Germans resisted. "We do not need American methods," they said. "German engineering is superior." Klaus shook his head every time. "German engineering is excellent," he would reply. "But excellent engineering without resources to support it is just craft work. We need to learn what the Americans understand, how to build systems, not just machines." 20 years have passed. Klaus became an industrial consultant, helping German companies rebuild and modernize. In 1965, he was invited to speak at an engineering school. He brought photographs. One showed a Tiger tank. Another showed a Pershing. He put them side by side on the projector. "I loved the Tiger," Klaus told the students. "It was a beautiful machine. But it was also a symbol of how we misunderstood modern war. We thought war was about building the best weapon, the best armor, the best gun. And quality does matter. But the Americans understood something deeper. They understood that modern war is industrial. It is about production capacity, logistics, resources, innovation at scale. They could build specialized tanks like the Pershing because they had already built enough regular tanks. Their economy could afford experiments. Our economy could not. Every tiger was precious. Every loss hurt. Meanwhile, America stamped out tanks by the thousands and kept improving them. That 105mm gun on the Pershing, we never knew it existed until one shot at us. Why? Because we could not imagine an economy that could field experimental weapons while still mass-producing standard equipment. The real lesson is not about tanks. It is about societies. A free society with strong industry, educated workers, and many competing companies will always outproduce a dictatorship that puts all resources into a few wonder weapons. We sat in our tigers feeling invincible, but invincibility was an illusion. The Americans did not beat us by building a better tank. They beat us by building a better system, a system that could adapt, produce, and deploy new solutions faster than we could respond. That is what I learned staring at that 105mm gun. The most dangerous weapon is not the best tank. It is the industrial capacity to keep building better answers to every problem. We lost the war before the first tiger rolled off the production line. We just didn't know it yet. Klaus paused and looked at the young faces watching him. Learn from this. When someone tells you that your nation is superior, ask them to show you the factories, the resources, the capacity to adapt and change. Because in the modern world, superiority without capacity is just pride, and pride does not win wars. Production does. The students sat quietly. Klaus collected his photographs and walked out into the rebuilt German city. The streets were clean now. The buildings stood tall. Cars filled the roads. Germany had learned hard lessons and built something new from the ashes. But Klaus would never forget the day a shell cracked his tiger's armor and shattered everything he thought he knew. That moment taught him that the strongest armor is not steel. It is the humility to learn, the resources to build, and the wisdom to know that no victory lasts forever without the capacity to keep improving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.